Hey there, I'm Art from the Tech Bars Grown. I've got a fun video for you here on the channel today. I'm going to be showing you how to build your own Mini-ITX gaming PC in the SilverStone SG13 chassis. Now, truth be told, people have been asking me to do this video for quite some time, but I hesitated a while because, frankly, I'd done a written article about this PC case a number of years ago, and nothing's actually changed about the case since it was released. With that said, I felt, well, you know what? It's a case that I still love, I still recommend, I still use. Basically, nothing beats it. So maybe it's worth doing a video, but I'm going to change things up a little bit. Rather than do the same build I've done in the past, I'm actually going to use a liquid cooler, the Hydro H60 from Corsair. Now, this is going to be an interesting fit inside this system. I think it will work, but I've never tried it. So part of this video will be telling you, well, here's how it goes in, and is it worth doing? I don't really know yet. It's part of what I'm going to discover and I'm going to share with you. Typically, I actually recommend the Noctua NHL12S, a low-profile cooler that fits perfectly in this system, but of course is a little bit limited in the fact that it's a low-profile cooler rather than a large tower cooler or a liquid cooler. The other thing that I'm going to be doing with this build is using more high-profile RAM. This is SniperX RAM from G-Skill. It doesn't fit under any standard low-profile cooler, but because I'm using a liquid cooler, I don't have that restriction. So I can use this faster SniperX RAM that I like a lot in the AMD system. In terms of the other parts I've got the B450i Aorus Pro Wi-Fi from Gigabyte, a fantastic motherboard. The only problem with it is that it's hard to find in stock. Then we have an SFX power supply from SilverStone that packs a wallop, 650 watts. And the only thing you need to get it in this chassis is actually a little adapter that I have from SilverStone. It's called a PPO8 adapter. And that allows you to fit this small power supply in a bracket that's actually designed for larger ATX power supplies, which I do not recommend in this system. Lastly, of course, we have the video card. I'm actually going to be using a GTX 1080. It's a little bit older of a video card from NVIDIA, but it's a reference size, which is very important. I always recommend reference or smaller in this case. A lot of people ask, well, can you fit any Radeon cards in here? And the short answer is not without a ton of trouble and potentially some modifications of the case, which I'm just not going to get into. I don't think it's worth it. I'd rather you just stick with a reference card from NVIDIA. So anything that's 10.6 inches long or shorter. So with that, I'm going to open this case. I'm going to break into these boxes and show you how to build your own ITX gaming system. Catch you in a second. All right, folks, I've got all my parts laid out in front of me. And I also want to at first give a special thanks to Corsair for providing the multi-mount that's sitting above my head here. Really cool product from their Elgato line. So that's what's got my camera set up above me like this. Now, first of all, I've got my case here and I've kind of stripped it down a little bit. And I want to show you two parts that I took out that you should not be using for this build. First of all, this is a power supply mount for an ATX power supply, or it's like a support bracket. I never recommend using ATX power supplies in this tiny case. So that's going to go in the box. And then this is the SSD tray that actually fits on top, sort of like this here. And I frankly feel like this is an anachronism. Yes, you can use it for 2.5-inch drives. Obviously, I would totally recommend against using 3.5-inch drives in this system. But even with 2.5-inch drives, this really blocks a lot of space for cabling. It gets in the way of airflow. It gets in the way of accessing your case. I don't want it in there. So it comes out. And I want to show you all something. There's kind of a hidden 2.5-inch drive mount right here. These four screw holes here are for mounting, basically surface mounting an SSD. And I am going to show you how to do that. In case you do want a second drive in your system, I'm going to show you how to mount a drive right down there. It's kind of a hidden spot. A lot of people don't know about it. I like it a lot more than the tray up here that gets in the way. I am going to be using an M2 SSD in my motherboard, so that's going to be my main drive, but I know a lot of people want a second drive in their system, and you can still do that without getting everything all gummed up in your system. So I'm going to put this away for a second and start working on the motherboard over here. Actually, you know what? The first thing I'm going to do is put this in, because I sometimes forget to do this, and then my system's completely built, and there's nothing I can do to get it in. All right, that's in and out of the way. Let's mount that M.2 drive. This is pretty simple on my Gigabyte Aorus board. I love this board. Unfortunately, it's been sold out for weeks at the time of this video. So I'm recommending an ASRock board that has its mount on the bottom of the motherboard. So just be aware that a lot of ITX boards will mount their SSDs down here. Okay, you'll see them mount down here. But on my awesome Gigabyte board, it's right on top. I install the SSD like so in the slot, push it down. It's kind of spring-loaded a little bit. And then I insert the heatsink on top. By the way, all these heatsinks will have this thermal pad, which is not decorative. It really does function to cool down that SSD. So I actually have the CPU installed already, but just in case you're worried and you think, I don't know how to do that, I'll show you how this works. So these Ryzen CPUs are awesome because they have really hard pins that are very difficult to damage. Unless you really wanted to damage the CPU, you pretty much can't damage it. I just put it in. Note that the Ryzen socket, for whatever reason, is actually, I'll zoom in here, it is turned 90 degrees, okay? My motherboard's top is over here, bottom over here, and yet the Ryzen CPU is turned in its socket, and you may say, oh, don't, you got that the wrong way. No, actually, this is the right way. For whatever reason, AMD decided its sockets would be oriented this way, which I'm sure confused a million builders all at once. But anyway, we're gonna lock it down. It's really, really simple, much simpler than Intel. Okay, next up, I should note that these are the original brackets, or I guess mounts for the standard reference AMD CPU cooler, which I'm not going to be using for this build, but I do use these for the Corsair H60 cooler. Now, if you're using a low profile cooler, you're going to actually have to swap these out for whatever comes with your cooler. Notice the base plate or back plate that comes with the motherboard. This does not come with the cooler. This is part of the motherboard, and it's pre-installed. Okay, I'm not going to actually install the cooler yet because I'm using a liquid cooler and because I'm using these mounts, I don't have to worry about installing my cooler before I put it, the motherboard in the case, which is a great benefit of using Corsair's H60 cooler and the reference brackets. I don't have to put screws through the back, which of course would mean, you have to have the motherboard out of the case. So you know what? The next step is actually going to be installing the RAM. That's a fun one because it's pretty simple as long as you do it right. One thing I should mention is that about 99% of the time when people say, my system won't boot, I've got a DOA system, I'm going to return everything, it's all junk, they just haven't snapped the RAM in all the way. So I'm just going to drop this into the slot, but I really have to push down. I got to hear it snap on both sides or I haven't done it right. All right. So, and keep in mind I'm using this taller G-Skill Sniper X RAM. I cannot use this stuff with a low profile cooler. Again, another added benefit of going with a liquid cooler. Snapped in on both sides. I should be good. I should be good. Okay, so my motherboard's coming together and now I can actually insert this into my case. So let's move the case over here. So I've got my motherboard here. I really do love working with ITX chassis because I get to use these tiny motherboards, which are so much fun. You just have to hold the motherboard against its I/O panel, which is padded, so it gives a little bit of resistance. It's pushing against the motherboard. So I'm holding the motherboard in place and screwing in my screw to lock it in place. With an ITX board, you just have 4 screws to worry about as opposed to the 9 on an ATX board. I'm going to actually go ahead and show you how I install the 2.5 inch drive right here, my Samsung 850 EVO. You actually put the screws in through the bottom like that, and then I have to mount my drive. I'm going to have to hold it underneath the case, or inside the case I should say. Line up the holes, the mounting holes, there they are. So my Samsung SSD is mounted, kind of surface mounted down here. I'll actually go ahead and use my SATA data cable. I want as little cable as possible getting in the way of the airflow through the system. I hate these USB 3.0 cables. They're kind of, I don't know why they had to be so thick and hard to manipulate. We'll have to deal with that later. So they're kind of up in the air right now. All right, my drive, but actually both of my drives are in. This one's going to need a power cable. Another reason I don't really like 2.5 inch drives anymore, you do need to attach a SATA power cable. I will do that a little later when I rig up my power supply. But next, I think I should actually put in my video card, which is kind of a fun step. You know, one of the things about doing an ITX system that takes a little bit longer is you often have to disassemble your case before you assemble it. So it'll come like this, and then you have to start taking it apart to get things in. And you may wonder, well, why don't you just drop your video card in from the top? Well, let me show you. That's not dropping in anywhere, right? It's actually longer than the main section of the chassis. I can't drop this in. There's no way I can angle this in or push it in from the side. Okay, front panel removed, and I can install my video card through the front like that. Now, I often recommend an alternate configuration for this system that uses a much shorter Zotac card. Zotac is a specialist in Mini-ITX friendly cards, and their card is, I think, under 9.5 inches long. I think it actually might be more like 8.6 or something like that. So you can actually probably drop that one in from the top. Notice that I have to remove another component of the case. This is the VGA bracket or lockdown holder. Got to remove that. Drop this in, line it up with the PCI slot. Okay, then I have to reattach the rear bracket on the SG13 case. The next step is the cooler. That's how quickly this build is coming along, which is awesome. Now, one of the questions that a lot of people ask me when it comes to installing a liquid cooler in this case is, should we do it with the fan blowing in or out? So I haven't actually attached the Corsair fan yet. This comes with the cooler. So the idea is, so this is the front, this is the intake side of the fan, that's the exhaust. The frame is always where the air blows out of. So I can actually either mount the fan and then the radiator, in which case the hot air, well, the air will blow through the radiator and the hot air will permeate the chassis. The advantage of that is you're getting cool air from outside the case. The disadvantage is you're heating everything up inside the case. The alternate arrangement is to have the fan pulling air from the inside of the case, which isn't as cool as the outside, but it's not necessarily extremely hot. It may be, but it's not necessarily. And then blowing that through the radiator and out the front of your case, okay, exhausting all that hot air. This is an externally exhausting video card, which are basically not really made anymore. If you have an open air card, then what happens is you're going to get a lot of hot air in your case. If you're using that as your cooling air through your radiator, that actually might not be as effective. So I will test it both ways though, so I'll let you know how it works with this particular video card. Okay, so I have my Corsair cooler here. This is the cooling block. I have some protective tape on it. The thermal paste is going to go on the CPU here, but first I actually have to mount the AMD retention brackets. So these actually slide on just like this. Note that most of these coolers will have the Intel brackets on by default, and then you replace them with the AMD bracket. So it goes like this. All right, I got one side in, got the other side in, and now I can mount this. So you have a thumb screw and then a lock, and it's actually really, really easy to use. You put the lock through, you attach the thumb screw loosely, just like that. I'll do it on both sides. Then I'm going to put my thermal paste on my CPU. I always use Noctua. This is NTH2, their best stuff. It's fantastic. With a Ryzen CPU, which has a fairly large heat spreader, I put a pea-sized portion in the middle of the CPU like that, and then I put some smaller drops along the edges. And this is actually recommended by Noctua, okay, for AMD CPUs that are a little bit larger than Intel CPUs. The standard piece-size drop in the middle isn't really quite enough to cover it. Now, this is the fun part. This is so easy to do versus a lot of other coolers. And remember, I can do this while my motherboard's in the case. That's what's so amazing about using AMD's stock brackets. So I just go alternating side to side so that I get nice even tension on the CPU. The one thing I will say about this bracket is it's not spring loaded, so it's a little hard to say when it's tight enough. The metal basically just bends, okay? The metal bracket acts as the spring. So I just tighten it until it seems to really be pressing down and bending the metal here. This metal actually kind of warps, which is actually how it's designed. That's how it's supposed to work. So that's in. So I got my cooler in. Next step, mounting the radiator. Okay, for a second there, I thought I was in trouble. The SSD mounted at the bottom of the chassis actually made it impossible for me to mount the radiator lengthwise from top to bottom. Okay, it hit the SSD. But I was able to rotate this radiator. Let me show you. Okay, so I wanted it to go top to bottom and it would hit the SSD. I rotated it and it will fit as long as I pull some of the cables out of the way. So these are the cables for your reset switch, power switch. I had to just kind of get those out of the way and I'm able to lower this into place. It just barely fits in this chassis in that orientation. I can't stick a screwdriver in here if the radiator is mounted. So now that I know it fits, I'm going to pull this back out. Okay, fan is attached. I'm going to lower it back down into position. It's a little bulkier now that the fan is on there, but I'm pretty sure I can still get this in. There we go. Got some front panel cables that are kind of getting in the way, but I'm gonna be all right. Just screwing in the last of the 4 front screws. All right, so I just realized I probably made a slight mistake, which is that I didn't cable up my Samsung SSD, which is now buried underneath my liquid cooler. Now I am using modular cables like this one, and that's good because I can kind of manipulate it without the power supply in the case, but I still can't get this under my fan. I don't think I'm going to be able to attach it, so I'm actually going to have to remove the cooler and then install my power cable. One thing I should note is that the CPU cooler does actually require SATA power. All right, there's the SATA power cable. So I needed this in my system anyway, not just for the 2.5-inch drive. So you do need to use one of these cables if you have an H60 in your system. So I'll go ahead and connect that down here and come back to you. All right, my cooler actually does have 2 fan connectors. One that's actually from the fan itself, which is a 4-pin, and one is a 3-pin for the pump. So my motherboard has something that's called CPU fan, and I'll actually go ahead and attach the CPU fan to that one. Sometimes they recommend that you attach the pump to that, but I like to be able to control my fan using the CPU fan header, so it'll work just fine that way. So my other CPU fan header is actually tucked right back here behind that USB 3.0 cable. All right, as I've mentioned several times, I'm using an SFX power supply, and that means I need to use this PPO8 adapter. It has a number of advantages, and with this system what it allows is it actually offsets the power supply like so. All right, so that means you get even more airflow beneath the power supply than if it were, say, like an ATX power supply would be that, like that. And some other brackets are actually centered, which really doesn't make much sense. You want it to be as high as possible in the system. So I'm going to go ahead and attach that now. Now, before I actually drop this in the system, I want to get my modular cables in place. All right, I need the big motherboard 24-pin. This one here. I need a PCIe cable for my video card, and I need the CPU 8-pin that's right here. So without the power supply in the system, I have a lot more access to all the areas where these go. CPU cable in. Here goes the motherboard cable. Then I'm going to attach my video card cable. A lot of video cards these days require 8 pins, so you have to be careful that you kind of align these correctly together. All right, it's always in the form of 6+2, so make sure you get them aligned correctly and then attach it to the video card. All right, the cables are in, and I'm going to show you how to attach these to your power supply. Now, recently I had some people have trouble with these SilverStone power supplies because the motherboard cable is actually split into 2. There's something called the Sense 4-pin. This is the Sense 4-pin. It's part of that big 24-pin motherboard cable. And if you don't include it, you may have some trouble. So let's do that one first. That goes right there. Then I've got obviously the big motherboard cable, very easy to identify because it's so chunky. By the way, I should note that I'm orienting this so my fan is going to be facing the top of the chassis and get fresh air from outside the chassis. Here's my video card cable. Then we've got the CPU cable. And then finally we have that SATA power cable. My cables are ready. Now you can probably see though that this is still pretty bulky. These cables are pretty big. And I'm really glad I'm using an SFX class power supply. Now I go to the back of the case, screw in the power supply through its PPO8 adapter, and that's the last step in building this system. Luckily for you, I showed you a few of my missteps along the way, but overall, if you follow the steps in the correct order, which mostly had to do with that 2.5-inch SSD, building the system isn't that hard. There's the full thing. Let's take a look. You can see there's quite a lot of cabling in here. Here's my tubes, but luckily those are not kinked at all. Plenty of space. We've got a lot of power cables in there, but for the most part, they're not actually blocking airflow. And again, I've got the airflow, right now I've got it set up to go pulling from the inside and blowing it out the front. So we'll see how that works out. Before I close it up, I'll give you a couple more views of this system. All right, case closed. We're done. So let's get into the benchmarks. I actually tested this case in 3 different configurations using 3 different tests. And you can see that the H60 set to an exhaust, which is how I initially installed it, really wasn't as effective. It ran quite a bit hotter. H60 set to an intake is the way to go, but it is really, really loud with this stock Corsair fan. I also tested with the Noctua NF812X25, and it is just as cool, but way, way quieter, up to 14 decibels quieter. So while the H60 does deliver great performance, its noise levels are really too high from my perspective, and I suggest you upgrade its fan if you are concerned at all about acoustics. Here's what it looks like with the stock fan set to an intake, so it's kind of hidden behind that radiator up against the front panel. And then we can see the Noctua fan installed here, also hidden behind the radiator. If you have any questions about this build, just post them down below. Please do like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time.